Great. Okay.
All right. Now that we have
Welcome
our
now,
speakers, I will go ahead and kick us off. Thanks for those of you who got up super early, although I think maybe it's only a few of us, but it's wonderful to see everybody. And today's session is to celebrate our two JIM, Journal of International Marketing, award-winning papers. Of course, we have two, one of which, the Cavusgil Award, is for a paper that was published in the last year. And the Thorelli Award is a paper more of the long-term impact award. So the structure of the session today will start with the Cavusgil Award, and we will allow the authors to share their perspective on the paper. I've sort of left that open to the authors to determine how they want to approach that, whether it be talking about how the paper developed or later impact, et cetera. So I'm not sure what we will get, but I'm really interested to hear. And then for each paper, we have an invited expert who's familiar with the work to provide some commentary. And so for the first paper, that will be Matt Robson. And then we'll turn things over to the authors of the Thorelli Award, and then Attila will share commentary on that paper as well. So I'm going to turn things over to, I believe, Stan, to take it away for the first paper. Thank you, Stan.
All right. Well, thank you, Kelly, and welcome everyone. And thank you for getting up at this early hour or early afternoon hour. Nice to see some familiar faces. I guess, first of all, thank you very much for recognizing this paper for the award, and thank you to the AMA and the awards committee and Tamer Cavusgil, the namesake of the award, Kelly, the editor, Matt was the AE, and 3 or 4, I forget, anonymous reviewers, and my excellent co-authors, and Peter. Bad joke, sorry. Peter was my excellent co-author. I had a couple other very good co-authors as well. So thank you for that. I don't have a whole lot to say this morning, and to Kelly's point, I guess I'll talk a little bit about the development of the paper and what some of our thoughts were as far as the impact of the paper. It was the paper of that for that 1 year, and it's not that old yet, so that kind of remains to be seen what the impact is really going to be of that paper. So hopefully it will get cited a number of times in some interesting ways. So I guess origin stories are popular with superhero movies, maybe less so with research papers. But just as a kind of a funny beginning to this paper, this was when Peter and I and all the authors are from University of Alabama at the time, and George Franke, whom some of you may be familiar with, held the office right in between Peter and I. And George just came walking by one day and said, "Hey, Stan, I'm looking for some multi-country data, a big data set that has like data from 10 or 12 different countries. So I've got an idea to test a methods analysis about," oh gosh, I can't even remember what it was. And I said, "Well, yeah, I think we can try to find a sample like that." And Peter came walking by. I said, "Peter, don't we have some data like this?" and we thought, well, there's this X-culture data that we have that has big samples from across the world that we continually gather. And so George ran his analysis, and lo and behold, it wasn't quite working right. But the three of us started working together, and we thought, well, there's got to be an idea here somewhere. And looking through this data, we found some interesting relationships. So I guess it's probably not the ideal scientific method of discovery that we're taught in our doctoral studies about. Think of a really interesting topic and what the gap in the literature is, and let's go find this and really explore this idea. That's I suppose there are researchers who do that, and I guess I envy them. But too often it seems like it's a lot of opportunism going on and looking for data, and then you're finding relationships in data, and then going to try to explain them and find out why they are there. So anyway, we've kind of stumbled into this idea for the paper, but it was ended up being a quite interesting one. I guess I can't speak for Peter on this for sure, but honestly, I'm pretty proud of that paper, in part because it's the basis of it's a really simple model. The relationship between collectivism and trust was, really the foundation of the paper. And honestly, I wish we could have just stuck with the one hypothesis, an alternative hypothesis, and just built the paper around that alone with all the methods. But publishing being what it is, it seems like you have to build some sort of slightly more complicated model to be interesting enough to make it through a review process. But really, still in my mind, the main contribution is just that simple relationship between collectivism and trust. But the reason I'm kind of proud of it is because we used so many different methods and kind of triangulation of evidence to support that hypothesis. And as we started getting into the paper and hadn't yet completed all of the studies, but started presenting it at some conferences and getting some informal feedback, it was quite interesting because we found this real positive relationship between collectivism and trust. But when we talked about it with some colleagues from Asia who are from very collectivist cultures, they gave us pushback, thinking, oh, well, no, there's no trust. It's just all like social sanction. Maybe it mimics what trust feels like, but it's not really trust. It's conform or else there's consequences to this. So we thought it was a quite interesting from that perspective. So we had these 4 different studies triangulating from different ways. The first being this big study database from X Culture that we had a sample of over 6,000 respondents from, I forget the exact number, 30, 40 countries, something like that, that supported us in our initial thoughts as well. And even using kind of multiple measures of collectivism, Hofstede's, Schwartz, and Minkoff, and others as well. So probably, I don't recall in this particular paper, but when Peter and I have, and George and E have worked with kind of priming collectivism in several studies. And it's quite common for us to get a little pushback, and perhaps even some here on the call will say, well, when we're talking about collectivism, that it's a societal level construct, not an individual level construct. And, I suppose theoretically, being theoretically pure, that is true. But, there have been some other researchers who have an incredibly strong record, much stronger than mine. Daphne Oyserman, for one, who says that at the individual level, it's kind of the analog, the individual level analog to collectivism is this self-construal, for example, independent versus interdependent self-construal. And so, we on occasion, or probably more often than not, get some pushback to say, oh, well, these are societal level constructs. You can't start measuring these at the individual level. And while I concede that point theoretically, it's the only thing we can do if we want to establish any reasonable evidence with respect to causation. So we've had some success doing that. And sometimes for those of you who don't know, I worked 12 years in industry before going back to get my PhD. So I've, ever since I got the PhD, I've always felt a little bit like a little bit of an outsider in the academic world. And some of these things we do in experimental research and on the consumer behavior side still kind of surprise me, that in priming collectivism and individualism, or independent versus interdependent self-construal, it still amazes me that we can ask respondents to write a few sentences about how they feel part of a group or how they feel independent, and then you do a manipulation check, and lo and behold, it works. It's I guess I've done it enough now, and it works more often than it doesn't. But I'm still almost surprised when it does. But that is the case. So. So what I'm proud about in this paper is it kind of addressed a relationship that had some conflicting opinions about it. And we triangulated evidence with lots of different types of methods, experimental, a large HLM model, priming collectivism versus individualism to establish some causation. And in the end, we kept getting pushback as far as the managerial relevance for the model. So we ended up adding a fourth study with priming the individualism, collectivism dimensions with an ad, a couple ads, a print ad and a video ad, which again, to me, quite surprising, it actually worked. Sometimes you wonder out in the real world and industry whether these things can actually have any sort of influence, and they did. So Peter and I were getting good at our, well, I don't know how good, but at our creative skills and trying to create advertisements, both in the video kind as well. So in our DV, and that one was trust in the firm and trust of the advertiser, which seemed to also have a pretty good effect as well. So that's really the basis of our paper. We kind of grew the model a little bit from there. I think that's what we had to do to make it interesting. The reviewers were really incredible. They were, and we got great. I mean, Matt, we found out later, of course, Matt was the AE on it, and Matt gave us great advice, kept pushing us. There was, in particular, one construct that kept being mentioned, this cultural tightness construct, which was something, still is something relatively understudied in our field as an alternative explanation. And we thought for a moment, that's one of those moments in the paper development process. You think, oh boy, this just might blow us up right here. What's going to happen if this blows up the model, and is it salvageable after that if it blows up or not? And I guess the God smiled on us because it didn't blow it up at all, and we found the most up-to-date data and sample data for cultural tightness, and it worked out just beautifully. So the reviewers urging, the Matt his urging, and the editor Kelly's support, it all ended up quite nicely for us. So that's about all I have to say for a formal presentation or informal presentation at 7:15 in the morning and 1 cup of coffee in. But that is it. I'll ask my co-author here is Peter if he has anything else he would like to add.
Not really, but I'm happy to help answer any questions.
Or we can let Matt give his comments and then I'll talk about them. Thank you, Stan. Just before Matt takes over, just a comment on, I think, culture obviously is one of the concepts that we study the most in this international marketing field. And despite what I would I couldn't even begin to guess how many papers have been written on culture. And I think collectivism in particular, probably more than any of the other aspects of culture. It's really interesting when a paper comes along and teaches us something that we did not know. So I almost feel like the papers that have been published recently that add knowledge to that body of work, those I find super interesting, because I'm always interested in what is it that we don't know, or what is it that's changed that makes what we thought we knew different. So I thought this paper did a really nice job of contributing above and beyond what we already know, and is super interesting. So I'll encourage those of you who have not read it to read it. And I will, on that, turn things over to Matt.
Thanks very much, Kelly. I've changed my headphones. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, super. Thanks very much, Stan. Your origin story, I found that quite interesting. So someone walks past your office or has a neighboring office, and therefore trust propensity kind of comes up as the idea. So when I was a doctoral student in the late 90s, I was reading work on trust propensity. There was a special issue on trust in Academy and Management Review. So this was back when I had hair. In fact, reading this stuff was probably one of the causes of the hair loss, I think. So there was a whole special issue on this. And there was a paper in 95, Mayer et al., where they said that trust has trust propensity, it has perceived trustworthiness, and trust itself. So three areas of the concept. But I think marketing, since Morgan and Hunt before that, had decided to reduce trust to credibility and benevolence. So marketing basically redacted the concept, whereas management decided to investigate it in all of its richness. So there was all of that literature there waiting. And then when I saw this paper arrive in my inbox, I thought, wow, this is going to be based on a set of great ideas that just hasn't been carried forward. So yeah, I found your origin story quite interesting. But maybe a second element of serendipity is that the paper came to me, and I had read all of that research before, and I went on to do my PhD on something, not as good an idea, I would say. But I had a real soft spot for trust propensity because it's something that does have practical importance. Why is it that salespeople are not necessarily the most trustworthy people? Okay, that's a bit of a generalization. So they, as part of their job, they're able to spot trust propensity. They know who is more likely to trust them. And so trust propensity is hugely important. And if you look at what's happening now, we're in the sharing economy. So peer-to-peer. I noticed there's a recent paper on trust propensity that looks at the sharing economy. Secondly, we're in the era of misinformation. So fake news. I think all of our trust propensities have gone down when we see students' essays because of ChatGPT. We've got deepfake. So lots of different technological interventions are actually lowering trust propensity. So I think actually it's super timely to have a paper on this. And this paper is destined to be very well cited. Of course, it's relevant to international marketing and international business. So I think there was a paper in 2006 by Zahir and Zahir that met in Jibs that mentioned trust propensity a few times. So that was a commentary that wanted to stimulate research in this area, but very few people looked at it. So in your paper, there's a very clever, intuitive idea that trust propensity and collectivism should have some kind of similarity. So you dangle them together, and there's an intuitive link, but there's kind of a paradox because collectivism is a more societal type thing, whereas propensity works at the individual level. So that very nice idea immediately resonates to an international marketing audience, irrespective of all that management stuff that was studied in the past. But it's a really timely area because of the way technology has affected our trust levels. I think also the culturally tight idea. So this idea that, so if you're from a collectivistic society and you do something that is kind of untrustworthy, then that society will deem you to be a bad person. So that idea of cultural tightness is a really good one that very few people, again, have studied. So when I saw this come across my desk, my immediate perception was, wow, this is a really good idea. Of course, Jim, reviewers being what they are, reviewers don't necessarily always like to see the positive. And I do recall one of the 3 reviewers, I think it was 3 if memory serves, was kind of saying, well, hasn't trust propensity been done? Kind of attacking the gap somehow. So I do remember thinking about the wording of my first letter, and where you're saying, okay, this is the main battlefield of the R&R, and trying to find a form of words to take the gap, away from that, because I don't think that the gap was the battlefield. I think the gap was already there, and what you guys did extremely well is to focus on advancing the series of experiments to address their comments about mediation processes, about practical relevance, etc., etc. So I think looking at your studies, you've got, so your table 1 in the paper. So for the rest of you, if you haven't read this paper, look at the table 1, and that does a really nice job in explaining the need for the studies and how the studies advance each other. So we've got study 1, which is the huge survey. So it uses trust propensity from the World Values Survey, a single item thing. And then the second study measures. So in study 2, you use a behavioral measure using a trust game. Study 3 looked at the causal effect. And then study 4 introduced the managerial applicability. So on top of the way that you advance the studies, I think using social projection theory and novel theory also helps with the impact of the paper. In terms of impact, I think what I pulled out was 1, timeliness of the message to the modern world, 2, adept use of the base literature, going back to those Rotter references in the 1960s, 3, the rigorous set of studies, 4, diversity in the measurement approaches and their levels. So flexing the levels of the measurement and the types of measurement of the various constructs. And 4th, the novelty of the theory framing. So I think because of those 4 reasons, the impact is likely to be really, really good from this paper. So congratulations again, guys, and the team on a great job done. Thank you.
Here, here. Thank you so much, Matt. And I can't agree more. I think that when you can make a contribution in this area in particular, I think the chances for this to be an impactful work moving forward are very high. So thanks to the authors again, and I hope we see lots of citations for your sake as well as the journals, and keep up the good work. So we're going to turn things over to Katharina to talk about the Thorelli award-winning paper, which is a paper that's been out a little longer and is viewed as having the potential, having already had long-term impact, and I expect to continue to do so. So with that, take it away, Katharina.
Okay, so thank you very much. So can you see my presentation? So I don't know where it was supposed to, but I prepared the presentation. So thank you very much for giving us the award. So we were, of course, delighted to receive it. And today, unfortunately, I'm the only one here from Author Group. So my co-authors are Vesna Sapka from the University of Ljubljana and Diamantis Diamantopoulos from the Chair of International Marketing in Vienna, both of which unfortunately can't be here today due to conflicting appointments in their agenda. So what I thought of in my presentation is, oops, I think I have to make this a bit smaller. In this presentation is what you suggested, Kelly, to first talk about how did we come to the idea, then to present the key facts from the paper, and finally to see a little bit to link to future research and how we think that the idea could be used in future research. So the idea unfolded during my time as a PhD student as the chair of international marketing in Vienna, where basically a group of doctoral students were working on consumer dispositions. So I think given the expertness of the audience, I think I will not give a proper definition. So all of you know what consumer dispositions are. But what we realized at that time, which is not the case anymore, is that there was a focus of negative dispositions at that time, so especially on consumer ethnocentrism, that it was a bit unclear of how different constructs would behave in different contexts. So they were usually context specific, always researched in one particular context, but not in a different one. So I will come to that example in a second. And finally, it was unclear how would which one would be strongest or would have the biggest influence in a specific context, because they were usually studied in an isolated manner and not all of them at the same time. So what we did is, and this was my also my tip number one for future research, is we prepared a table where we summarized extant findings, which also helped us a little bit to highlight our research gap. So as you can see here, so consumer ethnocentrism was the most researched construct at that time. However, what we found is that the empirical evidence was mixed. So obviously we expected a positive impact in a domestic context and a negative one in a foreign context, but there were also many studies that found no impact at all, which actually suggested that either the construct was kind of maladjusted, so that it's not really a good predictor in the specific context, or that perhaps other consumer dispositions could have a stronger impact in this particular context. And those two we identified were actually national identity and consumer cosmopolitanism. So for national identity, we primarily based ourselves on a paper from Peter Fellich in 2007 and Chips, who suggested it as an alternative predictor in a domestic context, and who said that it can very well, it's an alternative, or it's a very good additional predictor for predicting domestic country bias. However, he did not really apply it in a foreign context. So the numbers that you see here, they are actually based on correlation matrices he had in a paper, but he did not have hypotheses on that or any theoretical assumptions of how the construct would behave in a foreign context. And then for consumer cosmopolitanism, I think a lot had been published on it. So also thanks to Attila and his colleagues and his work. However, what we also saw is that it was unclear how it would behave together. So in one conceptual framework with all the others, for example, would a positive bias of consumer cosmopolitanism, who is obviously pro-domestic, could that outweigh, for example, a negative bias due to consumer ethnocentrism? So that was unclear at that time. So then, so here are the key definitions. So I spare you that, given that all of you probably know the three constructs. And what was new is actually that we strongly went into social psychology literature, and especially on social identity theory. And we tried to find a concrete theoretical grounding in this theory. So we identified consumer ethnocentrism as a pro-in-group and anti-out-group construct, meaning that it can predict in both contexts. For national identity, actually, when you look into the social psychology literature, you will see it's a pro-in-group construct. So that's basically when you look at basic work and you see you divide people into groups. So let's say all in this chat room would be, some people would be randomly assigned to group A and some people randomly assigned to group B. Then you would actually start with some pro-in-group behavior, like supporting your group, liking your group, but that has nothing to say of what you think about the other group. So the other people that are in group B, you might like them, you might dislike them. You cannot really predict it from this theory. So it's essentially a pro-in-group construct, which shows attachment towards the in-group, but no specific behavior towards the out-group. And we thought in a similar way, the same could be true for cosmopolitanism, who have been defined as world citizens. So they are at home everywhere in the world. And according to Riefler, Diamantopoulos, and Ziguev, they are exhibiting an open-mindedness, appreciate diversity, and are positively disposed towards consuming foreign products. So we thought it's essentially a pro-outgroup construct. And with respect to the home country context, again, we could predict everything from a positive attachment towards a negative behavior. It's unclear. And then basically we came up with a relatively simple model. So the idea here was not because of the complexity of the model. So the idea here was more to bring a newness value and contribution through the hypothesis. Indeed, we had for the first time all three constructs at the same model, and we basically assessed their predictive validity in different contexts, and also tried to figure out which construct would be the strongest predictor in a different context. So these were our hypotheses. So in a domestic context, we actually predicted, which was new at that time, that national identity would be a stronger predictor than consumer ethnocentrism, and so could basically replace consumer ethnocentrism on the long run, because we think it's a very useful construct. Whereas in the foreign context, we expected cosmopolitanism to have the biggest impact, and a national identity having no impact. So then how did we collect data? So data were collected in 2 countries, Austria and Slovenia. We always gathered representative samples via a market research agency. Measures were taken from previous research and were all established measures. And finally, we analyzed results using structure equation modeling with Israel. And so for the relative hypothesis, we actually had nested models. So, and because models had non-nested models, and because of that, it was not possible to have a chi-square difference test. So we actually used different coefficients like the expected cross-validation index, archaic information criterion, and variance explained to assess which construct has the biggest impact. Now for the statistics, I let you read the paper because there's loads of tables and figures that give detailed results. So here, in the interest of time, I just wanted to focus on the key results. So basically what we found is that in a domestic context, national identity was the strongest predictor. So it was able to outperform consumer ethnocentrism and also cosmopolitanism. Whereas in the foreign context, we had sort of mixed findings. So as you can see here for hypothesis 3, cosmopolitanism and product judgments, we found only partial support, because surprisingly also national identification had a positive influence in a domestic context. So again, coming back to social identity theory, that's what we said earlier. National identity is a pro-in-group measure, but the impact towards outgroups can be everything from positive, negative to neutral. So it was not completely surprising, but still never found before in the literature. And for hypothesis 4, as you can see here, we have mixed evidence. So we have full support for Slovenia. And in Austria, we have totally a reverse relationship. So there you can see that the negative influence of ethnocentrism was stronger than the positive influence of cosmopolitanism. Now, what do we think we have learned from our research? So first is when you look at the domestic context, we actually thought that when we published the paper, or when we wrote the paper, on the long run, NATID might be used, or national identity might be used more often than consumer ethnocentrism, because we basically think it's a more powerful construct. So first of all, across studies that are now conducted on this construct, it was always concerning a bigger segment. So I personally believe that ethnocentrism is a rather extreme construct, because it's the belief that the domestic behavior is superior. It has moral components, like you shouldn't buy foreign constructs, products. And so it's usually applicable to a smaller segment in a general sample. Whereas national identity is an almost, I would say, natural behavior, as I explained earlier with this A and group B setting. So we believe it's concerning a wider segment. It's a very natural construct. And as we have shown in this paper, it can actually outperform consumer ethnocentrism in many ways. So we actually believe that it's underused in current study because we still see in a domestic context consumer ethnocentrism as a dominant predictor, versus national identity is hardly ever used. Having said that, there are a few exceptions that I just put here below. So for example, one of them is a paper published by Alexander Josiassen in Journal of Marketing, who used it in the other extreme. So he used it as a consumer disidentification. So what happens when people in a country actively disidentify with it, and how can that impact your behavior? And then the two in the middle and on the right, they are actually going a step further. So they are actually saying, okay, when we have these buyers against foreign products or in favor of domestic ones, how can we unbias it? So what can we do as marketers to basically prompt consumers with a positive behavior towards foreign products? And this is what is actually investigated also in the context of social identity theory and national identity in these two domains. And I believe this is also a good way of moving forward. And now for consumer cosmopolitanism. So here actually we see that we had mixed evidence. So we cannot really say that cosmopolitanism would replace ethnocentrism or the other way around. But in general, what I can conclude is, as I said earlier, so 10 years ago, a lot of people have focused on negative traits. This is not the case anymore. So nowadays, there's more and more research also on positive consumer predispositions. So there's a review on that from Barch et al. In 2016. And also here you can actually see several new papers coming up that basically, for example, this one from Balabanis and et al. in Journal of International Marketing, who looked at the impact of several positive predispositions and which one would be strongest in which context, or a literature review that Attila published with a few colleagues, where they compare and contrast different consumer dispositions and how they actually would predict behavior in different contexts. So we can see there has been done a lot recently after our paper afterwards. However, one thing that I thought that could be interesting, and also linking to Attila, who I know will prepare a comment on my paper. So I think there's this very well-known paper on the real world citizens, please stand up, in Journal of International Marketing in 2002, where you have this taxonomy of cosmopolitans having a global orientation and cosmopolitans having a local orientation. And I personally thought that this is super interesting because we partly supported that in our paper as well. So we basically found that cosmopolitanism also has a positive impact in a domestic context, which is kind of unexplained by theory and also unexplained by extant conceptualization. So extant scales of cosmopolitanism, they exclusively focus on the foreign aspect, and that you basically appreciate diversity, that you appreciate something which is that you don't know, but it does not have any items or any aspects of how cosmopolitan consumers behave in a local context, and how would you actually deal with products from their home country. So for me, this is still a sort of question mark. And there is a lot of foundation for potential avenue for future research in that paper. So I'm already at the end. So given that we had only a short time frame, so we thank you very much for this prestigious award. And that's me on behalf of course, myself and my co-authors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katharina, for I think for this paper, because it's had longer term impact, it was really nice to see you kind of call out some of the work that very likely viewed this as a building block to what they're studying. So I see this also as a paper that's going to continue to have impact, and especially around you. I was glad to see you suggest all these potential studies looking at boundary conditions for this idea of national identity, and how some of the disruptions I think would be interesting to see how some of the disruptions we're seeing, whether it be trade wars or either political or other types of conflict, this things that we're hearing about more and more these days. Be curious to see how some of that plays into some of your findings. But I will let Attila continue to give the commentary on this paper. And thank you again, Katharina. And Attila, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Katharina. You did such a wonderful job of explaining your research. First, let me apologize for coming in a few minutes late because I had trouble with the technology, but fortunately my wife was around and she fixed it and I was able to come on. Now to the paper. When I first read this paper, when it was published, I was really impressed with it for a number of good reasons. Even though, of course, I had been involved in in-group, out-group dispositions research for some time, and I was familiar with the works of many of you, plus other people, of course, our other colleagues who had been doing research in this area. I was impressed with this paper, as Katharina explained, for the fact that they addressed the possible influence both individually as well as in concert of three separate consumer dispositions. Not only did they address the three of these predispositions, consumer predispositions, and their effects on in-consumer behavior, I was also impressed that they did this in a two-country, well, not a two-country, I mean, of course, two-country, but also in a foreign and a domestic domestic product context. So that was kind of new or novel, with which I was impressed. And they also looked at not only willingness to buy, which is, of course, a typical dependent variable that we all work with, but they also included product judgments, which we had not seen very much of in the literature up to that point. The Josiason paper to which Katharina referred does have that in 2011. So that was one of the few papers that had used product judgments. But of course, the fact that this paper, or Katharina and her colleagues, used product judgments in their research was also impressive. It was a good contribution, I felt. So the fact that they did many things in their research and in sort of composing this research, I thought was really good. Another thing that impressed me about the paper was the fact that this was really an interesting question, interesting research question. Again, as Katharina explained, there had been, many studies, which had looked at one aspect or another aspect, in one country or another country, and primarily on the negative side and in a single country context and so on. But the fact that they did look at both negative and positive and, possibly neutral predisposition influences in foreign and domestic purchase contexts, I felt was very impressive. So that's sort of an overview. On the more specific way, I felt that in addition to a an interesting research question, I felt that the author's conceptualization was really solid. First, they grounded their work in social identity theory, which of course is a well-regarded and of course validated and so on theory in our field. So I felt that was a good thing to do. The fact that they looked at these constructs, their effects simultaneously, was another good thing to do, as I explained a few minutes ago. Also the notion that they sort of connected their findings to findings from previous studies and sort of placed them in this already developing literature was also a positive aspect of their work, I felt. Next, I also felt that the segmentation influences of their findings, which they addressed, the various clusters, segments that their findings would address, would speak to, was another positive contribution of this paper. Finally, I would say the research avenues or future research questions that they listed, I felt were very appropriate, very apt. And I thought at the time that these research questions would be addressed by our colleagues in the future. And of course, some have been addressed, but I think there still is more room for future research in this context. For example, research on local identities, global identities, hybrid identities, and so on. I think that that is an interesting research question for today. In summary, I very much liked the research. I very much appreciated the way the research was conducted. I very much appreciated the way that the research and its findings were articulated in the article. I felt that it was very professionally done. As Katrina referred to a few minutes ago, the tables and the charts and the figures and so on were also, of course, were also a plus to the way that the story was narrated. I really loved the way that the story was narrated, conceptualized, described, and narrated. All in all, I feel that this paper was a wonderful contribution to the international marketing literature, and I very much expect that the paper will continue to make an impact on that literature in the future. So wonderful job, Katerina. And your colleagues. But since you're the younger of your colleagues, especially congratulations to you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Do we get to ask questions?
I have a question, which is purely out of curiosity, and it is directed to all of you. When you see a paper accepted, do you have a sense that you're, like this is gonna really impact, or are you surprised, I guess, at the papers that ultimately have long-term impact? So any one of you could answer that question.
Go ahead, Matt and Peter and Stan and the others.
Okay, I'll go. I mean, I think I have actually asked that question many times, especially to editors. Like, when you accept a paper, do you know that it's gonna be a hit? And I think the answer most of the time is no. That I mean, obviously, with your own research, clearly there are some articles that I think are a little better than others, and there are some that you hope are gonna be cited more frequently, and obviously journal quality does play a role as well, but truly, I mean, both in terms of when I read other papers, there are some, oh, this one's gonna be so influential, and then a few years later, not much has happened. And same with your own. So I think the answer oftentimes is no.
I'd like to speak to that, and I think Peter is absolutely right. Nonetheless, I think when you read papers, you know, you can have a feel about which ones have the greater possibility of making an impact. At least that's the case in my case.
Yeah. I also agree with Attila. So I have one hit, for example, which was a literature review. And I always thought, like in the beginning, like it's getting increasingly more difficult to publish literature reviews. But if you do manage to publish it, I think it's almost naturally often cited, because whenever somebody does a literature review in another project, he usually has to cite you. Otherwise, he gets even a hint from reviewers. Well, you have not cited this literature review. So I think that's, for example, yeah, a good example for something which is often cited.
A couple of thoughts. I think both of these papers are researching dispositions or traits, but they're things that have become more important over time. So national identity, look at what's happening at the moment. That's hugely important now. Yes. And I think trust propensity levels nosediving because of modern technologies. So it's almost as if you need a crystal ball, isn't it? So, you know, one approach I think is to go for some kind of hot topic that lots of other people are researching and hoping to be at the vanguard to get primacy to publish earlier. But that's not necessarily the case with these papers. You know, somehow you've come up with really good research ideas, publish them, and the impact is going to go up because those ideas have become more important over the years. So, you know, you need to fess up. How did you do it? Did you use crystal balls, tarot cards? Is there any way of hedging our bets here?
We just had George walking down the hallway saying, hey, you got some data?
Who is this George person? Does he even exist? Can you introduce me to him?
He's a good guy. Well, he's now happily retired.
I'd like to add one little thing to Matt's comment. It is true, but on the trust, nosediving, I think, and you mentioned this actually earlier, the sharing economy, can be an interesting, the role of trust in the sharing economy, I think could be an interesting research question.
Yeah, in an international context, that seems like there's a lot to be done in that area.
Mm-hmm.
But thank you all. I really appreciate that insight.
I have a question I want to ask to, I guess, Katarina, but really I'm curious in the insights of the rest of you as well. So you mentioned ethnocentrism and how it's like a narrower and smaller group of people and so on. And like when we go, like the original Shimp and Sharma items are worded very, very strongly. Like I look at them here, right? You should always buy or should never, right? And clearly, if you adhere to that wording very closely, well, there are very few people who would like agree to these always and never statements. Then there are updated versions of the scale where people have softened the language quite a bit, right? Should prefer to buy, should attempt to buy. And when you word the items in that way, well, all of a sudden you get a lot more variance, and the mean of the scale moves up significantly. But then it raises the question, are we measuring the same construct as it was originally defined and conceptualized? So I guess that's my question to the audience.
Yeah, so I know that there's new version of ethnocentrism. So there's a new scale published by Balamanis and colleagues. There's another new version published by Sharma and colleagues. And the biggest problem I have with this, I think it's a different Sharma, yeah. Yeah. But it's apparently a very popular Indian name. So basically, what my personal feeling was, so the second Sharma version, for example, it has items that are identical with national identity. So and they don't convincingly talk about that in that paper. Whether, I mean, they say they have done a discriminant validity check, but you know, they have had I don't know, I think on the construct level, so they have something like 15 items, and then national identity as such has only 4 items. So if they check it at the construct level, is different than at the item level, because some of those are identical. And then also some of those new items that he has, like I love this country, or I love products from the country, that go into something totally different, which is patriotism. So that's why I thought that was actually also the idea of our paper, to kind of, like, originally when we started it in my PhD, to sort of clean the conceptual domain of the different constructs. Because also what I did not mention here, but for example, for national identity, there is a different version published in Jim from Kaler et al., which has consumer ethnocentrism as a subscale of national identity, which according to the social identity literature is not true. So consumer ethnocentrism is not a sub component of national identity. And so that's what we tried to do in our paper, to clean break the conceptual domain of the different constructs, to give them different names. And what I had the feelings is, when you look at the new ethnocentrism scale, that they again have, I think they have a good point, that as you said, Peter, that they are too general now, but at the same time, I also think that they fail to clearly how to say, like, differentiate itself from other constructs that are already existing, and they also don't show that empirically in their papers. I don't know if this was an answer to your question.
Yeah, well, I mean, so you're right. Obviously, there are papers that have explicitly develop new ethnocentrism scales, but then there are other papers that we just measure ethnocentrism as part of our paper, and we use a scale adapted from Shimp and Sharma, but there are still fine tweaks in the wording of the items, from like always or never to like prefer and so on.
I think a lot has been done wrong on ethnocentrism. So I can show you papers where they say we measure ethnocentrism, and in reality they just have an item where they say I prefer not, how to say, like they have just a preference measure, so they don't even have an item for ethnocentrism. But they say in the literature review that they measure ethnocentrism. So I think the word ethnocentrism or consumer ethnocentrism has been almost inflationally used. So a lot of people refer to it, and without really knowing what it is and what it does.
Questions? Maybe from a non-presenter? I guess I can ask one if no one else has one. To Katharina, so this is from your PhD project. So this project was started quite a long time ago, I would imagine. Now, let's pretend that your paper doesn't exist now. If you were doing this project now, in the post-Trump, post-Brexit, Putin-esque type of world, how would the model change? I'm wondering, would the constructs change?
I think the construct would not or should not change, but I think the relevance has changed. So, for example, 10 years ago, we indeed had a relevance gap because everybody was thinking like, well, we are moving towards globalization. There is no such thing as, like 10 years ago, I'm not talking, right? So like that was like, it was like normal that you buy more and more foreign. It was considered a good thing. And then nobody had thought that 10 years later it's the opposite, that people come back and say, oh, I only buy my like in my newest chips paper, we even had like direct quotes from Britain, which where they again have this made in the UK. We're being really prominent. And seeing actually buying non-new British product as really wrong. So I would say that the constructs as such, they have not changed, but the relevance has. And so that makes it even more interesting. I mean, that's my own perspective.
Yeah, quite agree. Thank you very much. Do we have any further questions? No. I think we're good. So I guess thank you for everyone that came, especially if it's really early in the morning where you are. Thanks to the authors and presenters for coming and giving us the story, the origin stories of their papers and explaining the impact of the papers. Thanks, Tilla, for your extra job in discussing. Thanks, Marilyn, too, for your questions and for helping to set things up, and Michelle, too. And thanks to our audience members. Thanks for coming. We really do appreciate it. So thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference, I guess, guys.
Thank you, everybody.